Alrighty, so let's talk about drills. I tend to use these Milwaukee 12 volt fuel brushless drill and driver. I bought these as a set from Home Depot. And there's two different size batteries for them. There's this one, and they're the same. They're both 12 volt. Just is, this one lasts a little longer than this one. And I'm gonna go through kind of the universal things that each of these have, that kind of every type of drill has. I'm gonna go through the difference between these two things and why we recommend having both, whether they're DeWalt or Bosch or whatever. We do recommend having a drill and a driver, why you wanna have both. And then I'll demonstrate putting a drill bit in. I'll demonstrate putting a little driver into here. And then we'll talk about drilling and screws and everything. For the sake of demonstration, I also have this Bosch 18 volt that I bought long before I bought these Milwaukees. It has since kind of, mostly the batteries I have died. And I was looking to kind of change brands. Anyhow, I wasn't, that's one of the catches with battery powered tools, is the batteries can be pretty expensive, that unless you really buy into a system, it's not that big of a deal to change between brands. So I had only had the Bosch drill and drivers. I didn't have any other kind of tools that use the system, so it was fine for me to switch brands. And I mostly switched because I wanted to go to 12 volt anyhow. In large part, I like the size of the 12 volt tools. But I'm going to show you the difference, mostly to kind of demonstrate how you remove the batteries for both. On an 18 volt, usually the battery slides off, and it usually either has a button in the front or buttons on the side, and they're pretty clear. I think Makita has buttons on the side, and you push the button and you slide it off forward, and it's kind of on these little guides. The 12 volt tools, the battery is mostly housed inside the handles. So on Milwaukee, you squeeze these two little things, and power tool designers are usually pretty good at giving some sort of indication of where you should be touching. So you have these two little marks here. You squeeze those and you pull the battery out that way. And you can see one of the reasons I switched to 12 volt is if I put this smaller battery in, it becomes this really small tool. That I found depending on the kind of job I'm doing, the type of work I'm doing, I can put this like in a big pocket on a tool belt pretty easily. And carry it around. I've never been a huge fan of the belt clips that some tools have, like this thing. I tend to never actually use that, and you can see I've taken it off the driver. So, we're gonna use the drill for drilling most holes, or drilling all of our holes, and we're gonna use the impact driver for driving most of our screws. And that way, we can kind of leave these each individually set up for the operations that we're gonna use them each for, because we're gonna go back and forth quite a bit between drilling a hole and driving a screw. Ergonomically, they're pretty similar, okay? They both have triggers that are variable, so the further I push the trigger, the faster it's gonna go. All right, and same for the impact driver. All right, they also both have this toggle switch that can go back and forth. And what that does is put it in forward or reverse, okay? And I'm right-handed, so I've come to become used to just knowing that when that's pushed in with my index finger, that's gonna make the drill go in forward. And what we want is, as I'm kind of looking down the drill, I want the chuck to be going clockwise. Okay? If I push it with my right thumb, that's gonna put it in reverse, okay? And make the drill or the chuck go the opposite direction. Reverse on a drill is mostly important for me in removing the drill bits. So, because I tend to put in drill bits by holding the chuck and just closing it up, when it's in forward, that's gonna close the chuck. When it's in reverse, that's gonna open the chuck and give me the drill bit back. Okay? On an impact driver, that reverse is important because it allows you to remove screws, right? So putting it in forward allows us to put a screw in, putting it in reverse allows us to back a screw back out. And it's the exact same way. If I'm right-handed, when that toggle is pushed in with my index finger, it's gonna be in forward. When it's pushed in with my thumb, it's gonna be in reverse, okay? These also use the same batteries. This battery is the same voltage, it's just a different size, basically the amount of time it lasts. But I could put this battery into this one, no problem. As far as the drill, it has a few other features. It has this speed setting, right? You can see on the top, and most are gonna have this. So they're gonna have a 2 and a 1. For woodworking, I'm almost always in 2. And what that's gonna do is when I pull this trigger all the way, the chuck's gonna go as fast as the drill can go. Okay, and the tool's gonna go as fast as it can go. If I'm using a hole saw and I'm drilling, say, a really large hole, or if I'm drilling into steel or something like that, I may put it in 1. Okay, what 1's gonna do is it's gonna slow the drill chuck down, but the motor's spinning at the same speed, and it's going through a transmission, which is gonna in turn give this more torque. Okay, you can see it's just as loud, right? But the chuck's going way slower. That is translating to much more torque out here. So if I'm drilling a really big hole, that comes in handy. A, it's safer. B, it's gonna do a better job because it just is putting more kind of force behind the tool, okay? Additionally, it has this little clutch that allows us to kind of set the amount of torque the tool has, okay? When it's in this icon all the way here, where it looks like a little drill, okay? That's gonna just put as much power as it can to the chuck. Okay, if I dial this down, you can see I can kind of override it. You can see it kind of clicks a little bit. Okay? Where that comes in handy is if we're, say, driving screws into really delicate wood or into something really hard and we don't want to break the screw, I can get it so that, like, once it bottoms out, it's not going to be able to overcome it and break anything. Okay, so it does come in handy sometimes. Because I almost never drive a screw with this, I tend to just leave mine in this kind of screw or this little drilling mode pretty much all of the time, which is going to give me kind of the optimal amount of torque. A lot of them do have this hammer setting, which allows it to act as a hammer drill, kind of. I find these little 12-volt drills, or even an 18-volt drill that is really primarily a drill and not primarily a hammer drill, it doesn't work that well. What that would allow is, theoretically, you could drill into concrete, or materials that like impact rather than kind of this like smooth cutting. Okay, the impact driver, on the other hand, looks much simpler. Okay, the chuck can only accept 1/4-inch hex tools. Okay, and if you look, it's got a hexagonal hole here, and the tools go in there, and the little detent on these tools gets grabbed by a little bearing inside there, and so the tool stays in. The way you take it back out is you pull this little knurled section, and then it lets us take it out real easily. Okay? So it kind of only accepts these, which there's a whole wide variety of those. If we look at the index I've got here, I've got kind of every screw type imaginable represented in here, and they all have the same exact 1/4-inch hex. Okay, so we put those in there. Mine, this Milwaukee and a few other brands have this kind of speed setting, so I have 1, 2, and 3. So in addition to kind of this variable speed with the trigger, I can set it to kind of my maximum speed within these. So 1, the maximum speed's, you know, medium or kind of low. 3, it's really, really fast. Okay, and in this screw mode, it ramps into the maximum speed, so it's a little, the screw mode's a little weird. I tend never to use it. I personally work in 2 most of the time. I would recommend, if you guys get a drill or an impact driver with variable speed, start at 1, because these things can take off. They can go pretty quick, and before you know it, you've driven the screw way too deep. Okay? Okay, so next, we're going to talk about screws and these drill countersinks, these tapered drill countersinks. When I'm driving a screw, I try to almost always use one of these if I can, if I have one that matches the screw size. These are limited in their length, and every now and then, if I'm, say, installing a kitchen, I need to drive some pretty long screws. So these, you know, but for what we're doing, these are going to be amazing. If you bought the kit, the DeWalt kit or Milwaukee or whatever, hopefully it came with an Allen wrench, and that's going to allow you to adjust this countersink on the drill itself, because you can see what we want to do, and the illustrations kind of cover this, is we want this countersink to match this head, but we also want to drill a hole that's deep enough. So you can see right now, I clearly have this set up to drill for a really short screw. We're going to use 1¼ inch screws for this first project because we're putting together two 3/4 inch pieces of wood, and we want to make sure we don't come through the back side. So we kind of round down to the closest 1/4 inch. If we used 1½ inch screws, we would definitely poke the edge back through the end of the screw through the back side of the workpiece. So I'm going to take this Allen wrench and I'm going to loosen these 2 little set screws in here, and that's going to allow me to move this thing up and down. Right, I could take it all the way off if I wanted. Okay, and I'm going to adjust that so that it's about as long as the screw from this tiny little edge there, right? So I want to get it so just about right there. I sometimes, if I'm going to soft wood, which we're doing, I'll make it a hair short, just so that very end kind of grabs extra tight. So maybe we'll make it, say, like that. I'm going to tighten these up. Okay, and I'm going to make sure they're really tight. Not so much that I break the drill, but I'm going to tighten them up pretty good because these things can kind of move around. Okay. I have learned the hard way that I adjust this when it's not in my drill, because I've found that if it's in the drill and I adjust this, it could be slightly less safe, but I also can sometimes bend the drill bit accidentally. So I've found if I take it out first and adjust them, I'm much less likely to bend the drill bit as I tighten those up. Okay. And you can see it's barely tapered. It's illustrated a little bit better in these kind of bigger diameter ones. This is for a number 10 screw. This one's going to be for number 8. I'm using number 8 by 1¼ screws. We talk about them in the screw video. These particular ones, these grip right construction screws, I like a Torx drive. Some people tend to like a Phillips or a square or a combo. I'm using Phillips less and less because I'm just tired of stripping screw heads out. Torx basically will not strip. So it's really easy. They get a really nice positive kind of drive on their associated drivers. So you can really, they really like made up together really, really well. So I tend to use Torx drive. 1¼ I like these screws because it does have a tiny bit that's not threaded, and we'll talk about why that's beneficial a little bit in this. And also I have an illustration that kind of outlines that. So I pretty much always pre-drill into wood, and there's 2 main reasons for that. One, it's gonna limit my splitting, and I think a lot of people think that that's kind of the only reason you pre-drill, is to kind of limit your splitting. The real reason is a screw is really just a little clamp, okay? And in an ideal scenario, if I'm screwing this piece of scrap wood to this piece of scrap wood, okay, I don't want any of the threads in a totally ideal scenario to be engaged in this piece of wood. I only want the screw to be grabbing onto this piece of wood, okay? That's where the advantage of not having threads all the way up the shank can come in handy. That is also where a tapered drill bit comes in handy. Is you can imagine if I use a tapered drill bit through this board into this board, the hole in this one's going to be a little bigger, which is going to give me a little bit more room for this screw. Okay, if you don't pre-drill, and if this is engaged in both, what can tend to happen, and I'm going to demo this kind of a wrong way of doing things, as it punches through this first board, it lifts up, right, and then it goes in there, and because it's only a clamp, but it's grabbing onto both pieces of wood, you end up with a gap there. And kind of no matter how tight the screw gets, that gap never closes until it strips this board out, right? Until the threads get stripped out. The problem is, right, you can sometimes strip this one out first, or you can break the head of the screw off. So let's try and drive this screw without pre-drilling. Right, and you can see, because I didn't pre-drill with this countersink, that screw head's sitting proud, okay? I could drive that deep enough that it might go in there. It would probably split this because that screw head, without a kind of corresponding countersink, it's gonna be acting kind of like a little wedge, and you can see it is starting to split it. But more importantly, look at the gap we've kind of opened up, okay? That's no good. And you see this a lot in people's construction when they use screws is they don't pre-drill, and they end up with these gaps everywhere, and they just think it's okay. And in reality, the strength of the joint comes from these two pieces of wood being really tight up against each other. Okay, right now the only thing that's making that joint strong is that screw, which isn't all that strong, to be honest. Okay, so I'm gonna back this out. Okay, and I'm gonna pre-drill it. Same pieces of wood, pre-drill it first with this drill that I've already adjusted the countersink. And I'm gonna go down until that shoulder of the countersink just barely hits, and you'll see the shape of the hole it's gonna make. Okay, so you can see it's got this little cone in there now. And look at that. First of all, the head's down in there nice and tight, right? And there's no gap. It's a world of difference. Now, be aware that these can be really fast. It can kind of take off from you. So I tend to kind of like pump the trigger a little bit, especially when I get close, because if I just like white knuckle this and go as fast as I can, I'm gonna drive that screw way too deep. And we do run the risk of splitting the board, particularly in this first project in which some of our screws are coming really close to the edge. If your driver happens to have a speed selector, I would say as you're getting used to it, put it in speed 1 and try and get used to it that way. The next thing I'm going to talk about real quick, if you notice when I drilled the hole, I drilled kind of part way and I backed out. What happens with drilling is you're making a hole, you're also creating a bunch of dust, and it's really important that that dust can get removed out of that hole. So when I'm drilling, particularly with the drill countersink, I'll tend to like back out a few times, which is just allowing the dust to evacuate, and I'll show you again. All right, and that's just allowing the dust to get out of the hole. We'll drive another one just for demonstration's sake. So I'm gonna put on the drive, locate it in the hole. And you can find if you didn't drill quite deep enough, that your countersink wasn't quite deep enough, you hear that like kind of punching noise? That is this impact driver loading up. And we drive that screw kind of nice and perfectly, and you can see it's nice and tight up against there, and it's so much stronger than the previous one. Lastly, in the demonstration videos for the chair, we use these quick clamps quite a bit. These are smaller than the ones I asked you guys to get. I have both big and small ones, and for this little demo I'm going to use these small ones because they fit in the frame a little better. This same thing has a little clutch that you pull. It's usually a little metal piece, but I think the Bessie ones, it's a little red thing in the middle of the trigger. All right, and that clutch allows me to scoot this around really quick. All right, then once I get close, I can pull this trigger and tighten it up. I find these are really handy because they can operate pretty well one-handed. If I need to adjust it, and I'm holding this, say, exactly where I want it with my hand, and I find this isn't adjusted right, I can tend to kind of use gravity to open it up more, or I can push it around. So they're really easy to operate with one hand. Okay, they're not that strong of a clamp, so I would never do a assembly with these, like a glue up, but I use them as kind of an additional hand all the time. So one of the things that's really important with the assembly of this chair is we are doing a lot of this drilling and then screwing immediately, and we want to make sure that we don't move those two parts away from each other after we've drilled the holes, because we have drilled a hole through one board into the other, and those need to stay lined up. So I will tend to, and we show it in the video a little bit, clamp this in place first, okay? Find a way to hold it that's reasonable. Drill a hole. Okay, and drive a screw into it. I'm going to put this in 2 because one's a little slow. All right. There is an illustration that kind of covers this. Keep in mind, one screw between 2 pieces of wood is a pivot. Okay? It's not really a joint. So you can see I can move this around still. All right? And if I moved it around counterclockwise enough times, it's going to pull the screw out. Okay. So that's a pivot. It's not really a joint. 2 is a joint. 2 between 2 work pieces. It's always about the relation between 2 individual things. So if I had 2 screws but 3 work pieces, I would just have 2 pivots. That's kind of an important detail, and I'll show you in an illustration. But you see every now and then somebody makes like a bench with a bunch of slats in it, and they have like one piece of hardware between all the components, and the whole thing, no matter how many components there are, can kind of rack around. So they're missing a little bit of hardware. So I would tend to put 1 screw in, make sure this is kind of staying where I want it, clamp it again. Maybe we'll scoot the clamp over this way a little. Put another screw, and keep in mind this is just for demo. I almost always, in a piece of furniture, make sure I lay out where my screws are going to be. I don't just ever eyeball it, mostly because I want it to look nice. All right, we'll drive another screw, and you can see how quick it is between having the drill and the impact driver. If I was having to change that drill bit out every single time I wanted to do this and put this in here, it'd take forever. All right, and you can see that's now a joint. I can't move it. So it has trapped those 2 pieces together, and it's really strong. Another thing that sets these impact drivers different, and where the impact comes into play, is as you get into a situation in which a lot of torque is needed, that kind of preloads a spring inside here, and you're going to hear like a hammering noise. And what that's doing is it's allowing it to give it like a ton of torque in really short bursts. Okay, that can come really in handy if you're like driving a really large screw, or if you're trying to remove a kind of a rusty bolt or something. It can be problematic if you just let this thing hammer over and over again. I could probably drive this screw all the way through this board if I wanted to. But I'm gonna drive it in here, and you'll hear what that sounds like, which is the impact driver kind of kicking in. So under a situation in which there's very little torque, you don't need it. It's not gonna do it. Right? It's not making that noise. Okay. But when I get to this bottom, and the screw's kind of all the way in there, that noise there, that kind of clunking, is this driver in here, this impact driver. What that does get kind of handy is you do kind of like get to fine tune how deep this is going, if you're in a wood that kind of can accommodate for it.